superpower. But the human cost was staggering. Twice as many people were executed under Stalin's regime than were killed by Hitler. Yet when Stalin died, many in Russia wept. In 1902, during this May Day demonstration in the Georgian city of Tiflis in Russia, a young political organizer and convicted bank robber named Joshep is arrested. He is banished to the north of Russia. During the next 2 decades leading up to the Russian Revolution, he will be arrested and exiled at least 6 more times. While in exile in Siberia, he changes his name to Joseph Stalin. The name will suit him well. Stalin means man of steel. For over 200 years, the Tsar's family, the Romanovs, had ruled Russia. The goal of revolutionaries throughout Russia, including Stalin, was their overthrow. On the night of October 25th, 1917, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The Tsar is toppled. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin takes charge. A new communist regime is established in Russia. And while Stalin is a party member, he is not yet close to Lenin.
Lenin didn't really know who Stalin was until the time the revolution really began to come out. But he was an organizer, you see. His gifts were those of organizing, and eventually he got into Lenin's inner circle, and Lenin depended on him.
For the next 5 years, Stalin works as an enforcer, operating on the street level to maintain discipline in the Communist Party. He is tough and effective, and rises swiftly through party ranks. In 1922, he is elected General Secretary.
It's probably best to consider Stalin to have been Lenin's right-hand man.
January 21st, 1924. Lenin, father of the Russian Revolution, lies dead in the Kremlin.
At the time of Lenin's death, it was unclear who would succeed Lenin as leader of the party.
Behind the scenes, there is a power struggle between 2 possible successors. Leon Trotsky, one of the architects of the revolution, and Joseph Stalin. Lenin has requested a simple funeral, but Stalin steps in. He orders the construction of an elaborate mausoleum and has Lenin's body embalmed. Stalin hopes some of Lenin's power will rub off on him. 4 months later, at the 13th Congress of the Communist Party, Stalin asserts himself as Lenin's legitimate heir. But unexpectedly, Lenin's widow reveals her husband's last political testament. The will says Stalin is too harsh and urges his removal from his party post. At the same time, it praises Trotsky. Stalin must act quickly. He takes a shrewd and calculated risk. He threatens to resign.
The choice was simple. Who was supposed to lead, Stalin or Trotsky? The majority were afraid of Trotsky and his extremely radical ideas. So they chose what they believed to be the lesser of 2 evils.
The party Congress ignores Lenin's last testament and chooses Stalin over Trotsky to lead. It is a choice many will live to regret. Over the next few years, Stalin quietly and effectively consolidates his power through a series of shifting alliances with other party leaders.
They were all pretty straightforward people. All except Stalin, that is. He was false and spineless. He always behaved like a sly Grand Vizier.
Even after Stalin takes charge, Trotsky and his supporters are a threat to Stalin. The power struggle between the two remains intense. They are seen together for the last time at this party member's funeral. Stalin ultimately wins the struggle. In front of the cameras, Trotsky is led in shackles to the train that will take him to exile. He is publicly humiliated.
After that, Stalin used the name Trotsky as a synonym for all sorts of treachery. The Trotskyists provided the perfect scapegoat.
Stalin is forging his brutal style of governing. Those who oppose him are muzzled. He is turning a single-party rule into his own one-man dictatorship. The Russian Orthodox religion, the faith of millions of Russians, is banned. Stalin will permit loyalty to nothing and no one other than himself.
And he also quickly realized another thing, that the religion he had cast off, spurned, had to be replaced by something else, especially with the Russian people. The Russian people believed in a simple trilogy: faith, the Tsar, and the fatherland.
Stalin orders all religious imagery destroyed and offers Russia a new god: himself. His image would now hang in every home.
So there was an exchanging of icons. That was inevitable. The whole system of power rested on it.
Russian Orthodox churches are destroyed. Russian Orthodox priests are targeted for execution.
They chopped off the heads of the priests and left their bodies to freeze in the ice. They were thrown into jail, shot, buried alive, or executed outside of Moscow, by the hundreds or by the thousands. There are numerous killing fields out there, littered with the bones of the Russian clergy.
Stalin's plan is now terrifyingly clear. He will stop at nothing to achieve his vision of a new Russia. After 3 years in power, Joseph Stalin announces his first 5-year plan. He envisions a new Russia. He launches a program of crash industrialization that is designed to turn the country from a peasant society into a global power. Enormous power plants are built in what used to be wastelands, producing energy for huge new steel plants and industrial centers. Often located thousands of miles apart, they are linked by a new network of railroads.
This was one of Stalin's real insights. He knew that war was going to come because he saw the historical forces at work. There was going to be a clash. How can the Soviet Union protect itself? Only through massive, massive industrialization.
In Stalin's master plan, peasants and their small farms are sacrificed to the cause of modernization. Collectives, or giant state-owned farms, will help pay for this enormous undertaking.
When Stalin took over in Russia in the late 20s, the Soviet Union, the country as a whole, was still only about 20 to 25% urban. It was a largely agrarian country, and that's why the forced collectivization of agriculture was so important, because you were dealing with a country that was predominantly peasant.
The dictator orders all agriculture to be collectivized at any cost.
What it meant was taking the land, the possessions of every farmer, every peasant, and robbing them of their land, and putting them all together on communal lands, and saying, you don't own these cows, you don't own that wheat, you don't own this plow, you don't own these things. It isn't yours. None of it, any longer, is yours.
With the stroke of a pen, he takes away the livelihood of 4/5 of the population.
All that belonged to our farm had to be surrendered. We were not allowed to keep anything. The order was given that everything belonged to the collectives. I don't know what drove Stalin to issue such an order. He destroyed human beings.
But the farmers fight back. They refuse to deliver their harvest. Without hesitation, Stalin orders a frontal assault on the rural population. A wave of violence sweeps the country. The secret police are ordered to search peasants' homes and confiscate all personal property. Stalin brings in brutal enforcers, like Kuzma Petrenko, to lead this operation.
We were sent off. They gave us a few horses, a carriage, or in winter, a sleigh. Then we went to the villages and systematically searched every single farm and house, one by one.
The police just came in and took everything away. It was impossible to hide anything from them. They took everything apart and searched every nook and cranny. We got a paper from the local Soviet detailing exactly how much grain we were to deliver.
We considered Stalin's orders to be law, ironclad law. We believed in him, and so we carried out his orders.
Land is simply seized, and kulaks, or landowners, are declared enemies of the people.
My father always used to return home late from work. But still, I waited for him every night so he could tell me a story. One night, there was a knock on the door. They were secret agents from the NKVD. And while my father was telling me my bedtime story, they turned the whole house upside down. Then they arrested my father. And as they led him out of the house, he called to me, "I will be back. I am innocent after all." And then I will finish the story. I am still waiting. I am still waiting today.
Hundreds of thousands of kulaks pay a terrible price for their refusal to yield to Stalin's will. They become the first prisoners of huge new work camps. It is the dawn of the age of the Gulag.
He reduced his people to slavery. He enslaved his people under the guise of socialist, communist reform. And the tragedy of that, it is on a massive scale.
New camps spring up everywhere that convict labor is required. The enormous pool of forced laborers inspires Stalin to even grander visions of modernization, like the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal.
Man gets used to anything. That's a fact. Getting used to it is a matter of habit. Even if you've never held a shovel before in your life, you grab it, and you get used to doing what you are forced to do. Of course, it happened that some of them croaked, sure, but that's life.
This project is completed in record time. But the canal is too shallow for most ships and frozen over half the year. Its construction cost the lives of 150,000 men.
Yes, this canal project was the idea of our leader. Truly, a grand idea. But maybe the job was too tough for some of the workers.
In this rare footage, Stalin officially hands over the canal to the Soviet people. He hates these ceremonies, but he tolerates them because they reinforce the notion of the Stalin miracle. And while Stalin takes the credit, men like Genrikh Yagoda, standing here at Stalin's side, do the dirty work. Yagoda is the notorious head of the NKVD, the political police. His job is to procure the slave laborers. By the mid-1930s, there would be 10 million forced laborers in the Soviet Union. Slaves to the vision of the Communist Party and Joseph Stalin. 1932. Stalin's modernization is taking a terrible toll on Russia. Apart from the major construction sites, the country is calm as a cemetery. This village has lost its struggle for survival. Even those who are not forced to slave in a gulag are close to starvation. Whatever food is left is distributed to industrial laborers. Meanwhile, the rural population is left to starve.
I recall very precisely. Our neighbor, an old woman, came to my mother and lamented. No bread on the table, but Stalin on the wall.
The people of the Ukraine are particularly hard hit. They had resisted collectivization more stubbornly than anyone else.
It started in spring. My older brother suddenly became very sick. When the undertaker came, he pulled my brother from the stove and put him on the hearse. And then he grabbed my mother and laid her next to my dead brother, although she was still alive. I started to cry, but the undertaker only said, "Shut up. You want me to have to come again tomorrow? She is barely breathing."
People can only save their lives by escaping. But Stalin has the roads blocked and train lines suspended. There is no way out. Millions of Ukrainians are trapped. The next year, almost impossibly, it gets worse.
One day, a classmate was absent. After a few days, our teacher suggested that we start looking for him. When we ran into his neighbors, they warned us not to go into the house. Something horrible had happened to him. He had been killed by his own parents, who had gone mad from hunger. And they had cut him into pieces, pickled him in a barrel, and had started to eat him.
The sheer murder of people as a result of this is almost incalculable. My God, this was a catastrophe beyond imagination.
While 5 million people are starving to death in the Ukraine, Stalin exports 5 million tons of grain. Life in Moscow is very different. Those who are willing to follow the party line and submit to Stalin's will are rewarded with cars, pleasure trips, and a glittering nightlife. There is no doubt in their minds whom they have to thank for that.
Поднять бокалы За великого Сталина, который ведет нас по светлой дороге к коммунизму.
Stalin lives with his second wife in Moscow. His first wife died in 1907, after just 3 years of marriage and the birth of their son, Yakov. In 1917, he married Nadezhda Alliluyeva, a teenager and ardent communist. Their life together is lived in almost total secrecy inside the Kremlin. And while they have 2 children, Vasily and Svetlana, Nadezhda sees very little of her husband. This is one of only 2 pictures that exist of the couple in 15 years of marriage.
The picture with the Rolls Royce. Take a good look. Stalin is sitting in the front next to the chauffeur, and in the back sits a very lonely, hunched-up young woman. See? That sums up her situation precisely. She is miles away from him, and she is very lonely.
Nadezhda wants to escape from the golden cage that is the Kremlin and make her own way as a Soviet woman. At the age of 30, she starts to study at the Moscow Engineering Academy.
All the students who came to the institute from the villages told her about the terrible poverty and awful hunger that prevailed throughout the country. She was shocked at this and told him about it. Of these students, nothing more was heard. They were all killed.
She tried to talk to him about it, and that caused outbursts of rage because Stalin was not just a husband. He was a Georgian husband. He was a husband from the East who would not allow his wife to have a different opinion. A different opinion in his eyes was tantamount to betrayal.
In fact, there's a letter that Stalin wrote to his wife in which he asked her not to participate in politics and to not allow herself to be manipulated by people into passing information to him or serving as sort of a back conduit, an unofficial channel to communicate things to Stalin.
November 17th, 1932, the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution. In the evening, there is a festive reception at the Kremlin. It is a boisterous night of dancing for the party elite. But somewhere on the sidelines, a fight breaks out between the Stalins.
That evening, he behaved terribly at the table, threw pieces of bread at her and insulted her publicly in front of others, so that even the wife of the defense minister, Voroshilov, said, "Let's go. The gentleman is not in a good mood tonight." He was very aggressive, and she stood up and walked out.
Nadezhda leaves the party in despair. The situation for her has become unbearable. Exactly what happened next is not clear to this day. A shot is fired.
He killed her. It's not important how he killed her. Whether he killed her with his own hands, or whether he drove her to suicide.
Stalin issues an official statement that she died of an inflammation of the appendix.
When he saw her lying in her coffin, he pushed her away and said she went as an enemy. And now, on the basis of my experience of life, I think he realized that she had seen through him. And what she saw was not the way he wanted to appear.
Stalin is now known as the ingenious man of steel and proudly boasts of his achievements. In January 1934, he convenes what is called the Party Congress of the Victorious. And while the delegates celebrate Stalin, they also praise another person, Stalin's close friend and aide, Sergei Kirov.
Sergei Kirov was the head of the Leningrad Party, very powerful. He was young, he was handsome, he was Russian, whereas Stalin was Georgian. People adored him.
After the upheaval of industrialization and the madness of collectivization, many party members favor a softer kind of communism. They support Kirov and elect him to the Central Committee by a wide margin.
That came as a great shock to Stalin. And in the course of the Congress, some activists also approached Kirov with the proposal to name him as Secretary General and have him lead the party in Stalin's place.
Kirov declines the offer. But he has become far too popular and poses too great a threat to Stalin. December 1st, 1934, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sergei Kirov leaves a party meeting at his official residence. At the same time, a 30-year-old Dmitry Nikolaev slips through a side entrance. 3 minutes later, they meet. 3 shots, and Kirov is dead.
Stalin had Kirov killed. From the 17th Congress on, he regarded him as his rival. And since power was everything for Stalin, since he did not know anything but power, he decided that all his rivals had to be done away with.
The Kirov assassination triggers a wave of unbounded terror. Murder has become legitimate government policy.
Of the delegates of the 17th Congress alone, 90% were shot, because so many of them had voted against Stalin, and since he did not know exactly who had voted against him, he had everybody shot to be on the safe side. After all, Stalin was Stalin.
98 Central Committee members are shot. 1,100 party members are arrested, sent to the Gulag, executed. Stalin calls them enemies and spies. He will soon turn Russians against Russians.
Смерть этим врагам! Смерть этим паразитам! Вот какой наш должен быть протест этим врагам!
Stalin's assassination of Sergei Kirov sparks a wave of political executions across the country. Now Stalin sees a new danger: enemies, traitors, spies who have infiltrated his government.
Hysteria was provoked. The so-called spy mania, the fear of spies that had allegedly infiltrated the state on every level.
Вся наша страна от малого до старого ждет и требует одного: изменников и шпионов, продавших врагу нашу родину, расстрелять как поганых псов.
With this line of argument, masses of people could be arrested and incarcerated, with no other justification.
Those who won't name names become suspects themselves. Neighbors turn against neighbors. No one is safe.
Informers were everywhere in those days. For example, there were the building supervisors called dvorniki. They were recruited by the NKVD and told to name 5 people from their block. If they could only give them 4 names, then they themselves became number 5.
In the dead of night at 4 a.m., the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, sweep the neighborhoods.
Being arrested was a relief. There was no need to tremble anymore. It was done. It was over.
This is the Lubyanka in Moscow, headquarters for the secret police. In its basement, a notorious prison, the scene of numerous torture sessions and executions. Both victim and interrogator remember.
That was the way the NKVD worked. First, you are locked up, and then they would always find a legal pretext. And if the law didn't exactly fit, they would squeeze your fingers in the door, knock out a few of your teeth. Most of the time, that would make you sign.
Yes, that happened quite a lot. If somebody didn't make the right statement, we would beat it out of him. Under physical pressure, he would confess crimes that he had never committed. You have to understand, I'm an interrogator. I cannot put my arm around your shoulder, compliment you, or have a nice chat. No, I have to get everything out of you that you are being accused of.
I told the interrogator, listen, I have done nothing, absolutely nothing. And he just answered tersely, I know, but it's cheaper for us to lock you up than to keep you under surveillance. Literally, that is what he said.
Whole sectors of society simply disappear. Stalin's infamous purges sweep the nation. All over the Soviet Union, like here in Kiev, mass graves are reminders of the horror.
Purge in Russian means chistka. Chistka is cleaning up. If you were going to clean the cupboard in your house, you would be performing a chistka. But his chistka affected millions. In 1937 alone, over 900,000 people were arrested. And these were not all the people who were arrested. These were just party members who were arrested. Of them, 300,000 were shot outright. Just, you know, after a 10 or 15-minute trial, they were just shot. These troikas would go around, the so-called troikas. They were made up of 3 field judges. And they would go from place to place, and you would bring somebody to the troika, and they would hear the charges, and the prisoner would say, I'm not guilty, and then they'd shoot him. It was as simple as this.
During a 2-year period, more than 1.5 million people are killed nationwide. Known as the Great Terror, it is a meticulously organized mass extermination. Former monasteries become preferred locations for murder. Even the smallest village must meet its quota.
Just like the production quota for timber, the quota for extermination was overfulfilled, especially among the country's elite. That was absolutely typical for Stalin's type of terror.
In Moscow, Stalin relaxes at the ballet. His favorite, Swan Lake. When the applause dies, he returns to his desk. It's a killer workload. He signs death warrants, often several thousand in a single night. Sometimes he finds the lists too short and adds a grim note like this: 6,000 more, no matter who.
Stalin would stay up late at night drawing up lists of people, whom to arrest, whom to execute. He himself was personally informed of how the interrogations would go. He himself personally gave the orders.
366 death lists, signed in red ink by Stalin himself. 44,000 names. Sometimes the dictator crosses out a name and spares a life. Those not executed are deported to the Gulag in Siberia, in cattle cars, under horrible conditions.
28 people were squeezed into each cattle car. We had nothing to drink, but they gave us salted fish. We were stupid enough to eat that because we could not imagine they would let us die of thirst. And we didn't have a toilet either.
Thousands of prisoners are transported to the camps daily. After 3 months and over 4,000 miles on the so-called death route, prisoner Peter Demont reached Siberia.
That's where we got out of the railroad cars. We stumbled and crawled, or rather fell out of the train. And of course, we were surrounded by armed guards who searched each and every car, so nobody could hide.
Prison warden Dantsik Baldaev recalls the horror.
As far as the extermination of human beings through labor was concerned, the administration of each camp and of the entire camp system was organized in an incredibly efficient way, like clockwork. The Gulag was a slavery institution like no other. Yes, that's the way it was. And you have to understand my position. I couldn't just say no and dodge the system.
Baldaev becomes the secret chronicler of the atrocities. These are the only authentic images from inside the Gulag.
It was a cannibalistic system. Literally, it devoured human beings. The life of the individual was worth nothing, absolutely nothing. The whole system was built on nothing but violence, blood, and a mountain of corpses.
In the fall of 1938, in October to be precise, we were 517 men. And in the spring of 1939, in the course of a single winter, that is, we were reduced to 22.
Here at the edge of the Arctic Circle, millions of convicts had to dig for gold in a gulag named Kolyma. Russians whisper, Kolyma значит śmierć. Kolyma means death.
It is a blood-curdling word, like nothing else. Like nothing else, it stands for suffering, misery, death, and human tragedy.
By its second year, the death rate in this gulag is nearly 100%.
They always transported as many prisoners to Kolyma as they needed. 100% of what the camp commanders requested was delivered, every year. For that reason, they did not mind masses of people freezing to death, or starving to death, or dying in other ways. They knew. Those who died were replaced.
As soon as they arrive in camp, prisoners are assigned to one of the various gold mines. Their quota? A staggering 100 carts of rock per shift per prisoner. Backbreaking labor to support Stalin's new industrial Russia.
If you stayed well below your quota, that is, if you delivered only 70, 80, 40, 50 cartloads per day, you were not allowed to return to the camp. You received only 7 ounces of bread, the punishment ration, plus half a herring. And then came the next shift, the night shift, and you were assigned to the night shift. And if you did not come up with your cartloads again, you had to stay out again and had to work a third shift.
And perhaps the greatest irony of all, thousands of prisoners write letters to Stalin, desperately seeking help from the very man who has ordered their imprisonment.
All our hope rested on Stalin. We really believed that all this happened without his knowledge. We were firmly convinced that he was a saint, the most holy one, the only one who could possibly save us. We all revered him and worshipped him like a god. Yes, we believed Stalin was the Almighty.
3 million prisoners will lose their lives in Kolyma. Yet somehow, Stalin remains above the death and deprivation he visits on his own people. It is a terrifying story of the power of myth.
Мы, женщины, помним и знаем, что нашей новой, счастливой жизни мы обязаны партии большевиков, партии Ленина, Сталина и герои героев, великому родному Сталину.
Stalin was a master at manipulating and maintaining his public image. An image that remained untarnished by his ruthless behavior.
Stalin was a man of the people. Or that is to say, that is one face of Joseph Stalin, and that was one that he cultivated very, very carefully.
Stalin intuitively understood and seized every photo opportunity. These images of Gelia Markizova were captured in 1936.
Stalin as the best friend of children. Now this wasn't very familiar. But now there was an illustration to prove that Stalin loved children.
Stalin used this photo with Gelia to portray himself as the father of Russia. But Gelia's father, a party official from Siberia, would become a target.
My mother greeted me and said, "Papa has been arrested, but don't worry, he's not an enemy of the people. They'll soon release him."
Stalin's henchmen claimed the girl's father was a Japanese spy. He was executed by firing squad.
He didn't come back. So, that's how my happy life, my happy childhood came to an end.
Тебе нужна всесторонняя ориентация и всесторонний учет всех плюсов и всех минусов. Каким был Ленин?
In public appearances, Stalin carefully burnished that image of the benevolent patriarch, the calm and self-confident leader.
Чтобы они были так же правдивы и честны, каким был Ленин.
His speeches were recorded on gramophone records. They transported Stalin the man, his message, and the power of his myth to the most remote corners of the country. It was all a beautiful illusion. But an illusion that was far from the truth. Stalin used every means available to hide the terrible truth of his reign. He commissioned heroic paintings, sculptures, and he paid particular attention to creating the perfect personal image on film.
He had a double chin, and he knew it. And when we filmed him, he always tried to hold his chin straight, and he looked like this, see? Like this. But when he forgot to do it and let go, then you could see his double chin, and we had to cut out those sequences.
I saw a group of people approaching, and among them was a man of very small stature. I look at him and I wonder, who could that be? After a while, I realized it was Stalin. He had a pockmarked face and his shoulders were very narrow. On the portraits, he was always depicted as being so broad-shouldered, so majestic.
Всего наилучшего.
This is how he wanted to be seen. His alter ego, the actor, Mikhail Gilovani. He was given only one role, that of Stalin.
He played Stalin so incredibly authentically that once Stalin, on being shown a fragment from the film, claimed it was he.
What mattered was that he looked so important on the screen. He wanted everyone to see him and recognize him as a god, a leader. That was typical of him.
Stalin also created a powerful series of propaganda films that allowed him to rewrite his role in history. This 1937 film, Lenin in October, portrays the events of the night of the October Revolution. Here, Stalin is a confidant of Lenin, plotting the revolution. In fact, he wasn't even there.
On the night of the October Revolution, on October 25th, 1917, there was a tea party in the apartment of the family of Stalin's girlfriend. Stalin drank tea the whole night, told amusing stories and Georgian jokes, something he liked to do. That's how he spent the night. The theory of two leaders of the revolution is pure invention. Stalin never played that role.
Stalin even rewrote his own history. Stalin was born in Georgia, a rough country on the edge of the Caucasus, in this small house in the village of Gori. In the 1930s, Stalin hid the modesty of his birthplace. The simple house was turned into a shrine. What the visitors don't discover, the small house was hell on earth.
Stalin was the son of a Georgian cobbler and a washerwoman. Now, there are a lot of stories, a lot of rumors that circulate about this household, about the violence of his father, about his father's drinking habits.
His mother was devout and very strict. This rare footage of her was taken as a film biography. Stalin had the project killed. When Joshep was 14, she sent him away to the seminary to become a priest. He would never forgive her.
I must say that Stalin's relationship with his mother was very poor. Sometimes he even called her an old whore in front of others or his colleagues.
But he would portray himself as the loving son. These are pictures from her funeral in 1937. Stalin did not attend the funeral. He sent a wreath instead. He had visited his mother only once in the last 40 years of her life. In the late 1930s, Stalin orders a wholesale purge of his fellow party members and military leaders. 8 of his top generals are executed.
He was afraid of them. He was afraid they would rise against him tomorrow. He hated them all. They were the heroes of the Civil War, who also knew that Stalin had been a zero during the Civil War, and they had no respect for him. What hit them came like an avalanche.
Over the next 2 years, 30,000 officers are executed. Stalin's army and navy is now leaderless.
He decapitated the Soviet military. Why? So that those middle cadres would rise up, become leaders. Why? Because in them he would have total loyalty.
Adolf Hitler begins deploying 4 million troops to Stalin's western border. Soviet factories are churning out tanks and planes as fast as they can, but Stalin needs to buy time. In 1939, he signs a non-aggression pact with Germany. Hitler agrees not to invade Russia. But Stalin has one account left to settle. The only surviving leader of the Russian Revolution. Leon Trotsky is living in exile in Mexico City. He is writing books about the revolution and Stalin. Stalin sends an assassin. On August 21st, 1940, Trotsky is dead. June 22nd, 1941. Hitler ignores the non-aggression pact and launches a blitzkrieg on the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers and their allies march east. The Red Army is caught completely off guard. Their losses are staggering.
Most of the troops on the Western Front, especially in Belarusia, today's Belarus, had not been put on alert. So we lost more than 1,000 airplanes on day one. This destruction in 1941 has to be blamed on Stalin alone.
He truly believed what Hitler said, and that was one of his most severe and most absurd political mistakes, for which our country and our people had to pay very dearly.
Stalin should have known. He should have known the war started that day. There were so many reports from Germany, Japan, and other countries.
At his dacha outside Moscow, Stalin is alone and not sure what to do next when a car arrives.
Normally, no one would drive out to the dacha without an order. The people from the Politburo showed up unexpectedly. When they entered the room, Stalin sat in an armchair and was deeply shocked. He literally jerked and asked, "Why did you come?" He thought they had come to arrest him. He realized, of course, at that time, that it was all his fault. He was to blame for what had happened so far.
Within a few days, Germans advance more than 60 miles into Russian territory. The Soviets offer no resistance. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers are taken prisoner. Stalin does not heed his general's warnings.
Stalin was not a man with any military knowledge. General Zhukov had warned him, "We have to concentrate our forces here and merely hold our position on the other fronts." But he did not listen.
On the 3rd of July, a shaken Stalin addresses his people. He declares the war a patriotic war. For the first time, he does not play the role of father.
He was totally insecure. That was one of Stalin's worst speeches ever. He stammered, and you could see how shocked he was, how terrified. And maybe he even lost his trust in victory.
But Stalin touches the hearts and souls of Russians. He appeals to their patriotism and conjures up the great victory against Napoleon.
The people got into the trenches and shouted, "For the fatherland, for Stalin."
His orders are clear. There will be no retreat. His troops engage in devastating, often pointless battles, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and POWs.
In the beginning, the Russians suffered heavy losses. As soldiers, we often watched huge waves of attackers just being gunned down. I would say for every German casualty, there were 10 on the Russian side. Their officers ran behind them, and when the troops did not advance, their own officers would shoot them from behind, wave after wave, and they were simply gunned down.
The Russian soldiers are trapped, caught between German forces and their own desperate officers. An officer remembers one soldier's fate.
He had been stripped of his epaulets and collar patches and was digging a hole. I did not understand what this meant. This man said, "Guys, I got lost. We're in the woods after all. I've been fighting and I will continue to fight." They told him, "In the name of the presidency of the Supreme Soviet, you are a deserter." He had to stand facing the pit. And then I saw someone shoot him in the neck with a pistol. And I saw him falling backwards. It was horrifying to me. I absolutely could not understand why they did that, because when the boy told his story, it was like a confession in church. It was evident that he was truly lost.
Not a day passes without executions of so-called enemies of the people, alleged cowards, deserters, and traitors.
Stalin давал такие распоряжения. All of this was done on Stalin's order. Nobody was allowed to discuss it or correct it. And thus the masses of Soviet officers and enlisted men were killed.
As Russian losses mount, Hitler divides his army and launches a three-pronged attack on Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. His Central Army marches towards Moscow, the center of Soviet power. During the advance, Stalin's son Yakov is captured. Stalin is furious that his son surrendered. An eyewitness describes Yakov's interrogation.
The interrogation was already underway, and the major asked, "Yakov Zhugashvili, what do you think about the progress we made during the past 4 weeks? Now we are going to march into Moscow." At that point, Stalin's son smiled and shook his head. "You are never going to enter Moscow," he said. "My father made sure all the houses are booby-trapped, and you will never enter the city." And the major replied, "We'll see about that."
In November, German troops have Moscow in their gun sights. They are less than 20 miles from the center of the city.
We believe that the mass of the Russian army had already been destroyed, and that the advance on Moscow was basically a matter of marching speed and not of enemy resistance, since there was no more enemy between us and Moscow. We were sure the war was over.
Stalin has the city fortified and parts of the government evacuated. He has a secret subterranean bunker built in the countryside. An emergency seat of government in case Hitler's troops seize control of Moscow. A train is kept waiting at the station for Stalin's escape. But Stalin stays. Now, the man who'd ordered the ransacking of churches and sent thousands of priests to the Gulag uses the power of faith for his own purposes. The churches are opened again.
Божиею помощью наша доблестная русская армия изгонит фашистскую нечисть из пределов нашей Родины.
With the future of the country at stake, Stalin sends fresh troops to the front. They march from Red Square directly into battle. Stalin will also listen to the advice of General Zhukov. Troops from the Asian front are sent to reinforce his lines, troops that are trained in winter warfare. Stalin now gets the break he needs. The full force of Russian winter stops the Germans in their tracks. The tide of the battle for Moscow has turned. The battle for Moscow has turned. Russian lines hold, and their troops now move on the offensive. Hitler will soon suffer his first major defeat. His forces are overextended, and his troops weakened by the bitter cold of winter. Within months, the Germans are forced to retreat. Moscow is saved. The Allies are now more confident in Stalin's leadership and Russian prospects. The United States and Britain ship enormous amounts of supplies, supplies that will make a decisive difference. But Stalin wants more from the Allies. He desperately wants a second front that will require Hitler to split his forces and fight on both his eastern and western borders. But the Allies are reluctant.
For Stalin, victims didn't count. His own people didn't count. They were just statistics. Neither the Americans or the English want to lose more people than they had to. That's partly why they lingered with the Second Front.
In the north, Leningrad has been surrounded by the Germans for months. Stalin could have evacuated the city, but he decides the people should stand and fight. He demands that every citizen take up arms, every soldier defend his family. Valor at any price. The siege would last 900 days. Hitler plans to starve Leningrad.
For a while there was shooting, and then there was silence. Why? The German shouted something inconceivable, which I hesitate to repeat here. They called, "You are going to die one way or another. The city is going to die."
Leningrad becomes a symbol for the suffering of the civilian population. Families are torn apart. Children must bury children.
They said my little brother, Yurik, had died, and shouted, "Get the sled from home and pick him up." I didn't know how to tell my mother. A truck came loaded with dead bodies just like they used to transport lumber. They were not sewn into a cloth, but lay there the way they had been picked up from the street. They were dumped into a pit. For a long time I stood there and watched. One of the volunteer helpers approached me and asked, "Why are you standing here, girl?" "I am waiting," I replied, "for the pit to fill up so we can put the boy on top. Otherwise he will be crushed."
Over 1 million people die in Leningrad from cold and starvation. But the hatred that Hitler stirs up will strengthen Stalin.
We went to war for the fatherland and for Stalin. You may deny that today, or mention only the country, but the country was linked inseparably with the word Stalin.
In the south, the German army is heading towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalin will defend the city that bears his name at all costs. Hitler desperately wants to conquer it. It is a battle of will and egos. But Stalin will put his ego aside and let his generals fight the war.
In fact, the generals were now in control. He only confirmed their decisions. Only on occasion, when he meddled with their business, things would turn bad.
This new strategy brings victory for the Russians. Stalingrad marks the turning point of the war. German Field Marshal Paulus is taken prisoner. The Germans offer Stalin's son Yakov as a trade.
When Stalin heard the proposal to save Yakov from captivity and let Paulus go in return, he thought about it for a while and then decided he would not swap a general for one of our junior officers.
Stalin rejects the exchange. He lets his son die in a German concentration camp.
I am often asked whether I hate Stalin for not bartering my father for Field Marshal Paulus. Well, I certainly would have had a better life if my father had been alive. But I usually reply that Stalin had no choice. Stalin was, after all, the man of steel.
And in a barbaric display, Stalin would parade German prisoners through the streets of Moscow.
I went to the Red Square with a friend of mine whose husband was killed in the war at the front. And we stood and saw these animals, as we thought. And we saw wretched human beings. They weren't even red-haired, as we thought, you know, Fritzes. They were normal, wretched people going on and on and on. And I felt terrible, but I didn't want to say that to my friend because her husband was killed. And she turned to me and said, "I feel no hatred."
June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Normandy invasion. The Allies' second front is finally open. The days of Hitler's Reich are numbered, and the Allies will plan the post-war era. Yalta in the Crimea. At a conference hosted by Stalin, the Allies meet. Stalin demands control of conquered German territories in the east. The Western powers are tired of war. They have achieved their objectives, and so they concede.
At Yalta, Stalin had a much more determined, not necessarily clear, but determined view of how the world was going to change after the war. And Stalin being that immovable object, what were they going to do? Invade him? He knew they wouldn't do that. And he knew he had all the cards. And the weakness of the West for him was always evident in its desire to compromise and its desire to be a good guy, to have friends. Stalin didn't need friends. Stalin needed enemies.
April 1945, the March on Berlin. Stalin wants to reach the capital and make it into the history books as the man who conquered Hitler.
It was important for him to reach Berlin before General Eisenhower, especially since there was no resistance in the approach from the Western Front.
He let tens of thousands die in senseless attacks just to take Berlin in time. Hundreds of thousands of lives were sacrificed, although the war was really already won.
And in a final act of vengeance, Stalin orders thousands of German civilians killed when they attempt to flee.
Of course it was drummed into our heads by our propaganda. Whenever you meet a German, kill him.
Berlin, May 1945. Stalin reaches his goal. During a tour of the city, high-ranking Soviets visit Hitler's bunker and discover his body. Stalin insists on secrecy.
Under no circumstances was Hitler's death to be publicized. That was Stalin's explicit order. For this reason, no photographers, no press, no film crews were present when the body was discovered. Absolutely nobody. It was to remain top secret.
Никто. Совершенно секретно.
Hitler's Reich has fallen. For Russia, the human cost of victory is staggering. It is the highest casualty figure for any country in the history of war. 27 million men, women, and children are dead. 1945. Russia is now a superpower. Stalin celebrates his European victory with a parade in Moscow. He now calls himself Generalissimus.
When the war was finally over, when it had ended with victory, Stalin, of course, became a god, a hero. That was an unforgettable time.
Stalin sees himself as the invincible general and conqueror of Hitler.
He was hailed as the greatest strategist of all times and all peoples. Of course, he was nothing of the kind.
In fact, Stalin was inept as a military strategist.
He didn't understand strategy. He knew nothing about advanced military maneuvering, and he just could never win a battle if his life depended on it.
The people did not win the war thanks to Stalin, but in spite of Stalin.
He wanted to liquidate anybody who knew about his miserable failures in the war during 41 and 42.
But in Stalin's fictionalized film version, The Fall of Berlin, he is the hero.
He wanted history to remember him as the great victor. Not as the frightened politician who was scared as hell of Hitler.
The propaganda film even includes Stalin's imaginary victory flight to Berlin. The film was created by Mikhail Sharely, Stalin's favorite film director. Sharely's daughter describes how scared her father was at the first screening.
The film was running. My father was sitting at the back. Of course, everybody had their eyes glued to the screen, but my father was watching Stalin and observing his reactions. In the episode where Stalin emerges from the big plane and the whole of Berlin kneels down before him, my father saw that Stalin slowly raised his hand and wiped tears from his eyes. Only then could he breathe freely and said to himself, "I'm saved." Stalin really did like the film. After the showing, he said to my father, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Bravo, lad, bravo." And then he said regretfully, "If only I had done it and had really gone to Berlin."
July 1945. Stalin travels to Potsdam in Germany to meet with the Allies. He sits down with Churchill and Truman.
When he arrived in Potsdam, the first question that Churchill and Truman asked was, "Did you find Hitler's body?" And he replied, "No." Maybe he believed as long as there were rumors that Hitler could still be alive somewhere, the anti-Hitler coalition would stick together.
But the Allies are too suspicious of each other, and the coalition will soon crumble. The superpowers divide the world among themselves. Stalin is now at the zenith of his power. But he is in constant fear of enemies, real or imagined. He travels on an armored train. Hundreds of miles of track are sealed off.
He had a marked instinct of self-preservation. You could spend hours talking about his security system with a special train and armored vehicles. He had thought of everything. That's why no one stood a chance of toppling him.
He was distrustful his whole life long. And the longer he was in power, the more power he had, the more distrustful he became. He thought they wanted to take away his power.
Stalin retreats to the seclusion of his dacha outside Moscow. He becomes even more isolated and withdrawn. Stalin's daughter Svetlana is no longer close to him.
I was his favorite, but also because I was good at school. Until I was 16, I didn't cause him any trouble at all.
But when she grew up, she started causing nothing but trouble. She didn't listen to him. She got divorced, and he never saw some of his grandchildren.
His son Vasily failed at school, but Stalin made him the youngest general in the Soviet military.
Well, he drank. He drank. It's bitter to speak about it. It was his ruin.
Vasily was constantly afraid of Father. He was so afraid of Father that he literally shook in his boots.
When we were sitting together, he was really quite drunk, and he poured himself another one, and I said to him, "Vasya, that's enough. Stop." Then he drew his pistol, which he always carried with him, and said, "I have only two ways out. The pistol is one, and the bottle is the other, because I only survive as long as my father is alive."
On his 70th birthday, Stalin makes a rare public appearance. There is a celebration at the Bolshoi Theater.
Stalin took to the stage first. Honestly, believe me, the auditorium was raging. There was hysterical screaming. Everyone was overcome, jubilant. Choruses, "Dear Father, dear Father," like that.
Дорогой, любимый, отец, дорогой, любимый, I.S.
This was precisely the time when Stalin was adored, worshipped like a god. And that's precisely what was instilled into the children, too. And my childhood began with this idea, and ended with this idea.
Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for almost 30 years and transformed a nation of peasants into a superpower. But a new generation of leaders would have to shape the world and the Cold War ahead.
After the bombing in Hiroshima, Stalin sent scientists to study the effects of the atomic bombs. And he concluded, and this is a typical, perfect Stalin calculation, he concluded that the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was the equivalent of something like 4 atomic bombs. And as a result of that calculation, he deduced that the Soviet Union could survive a first strike from the United States.
In 1949, Russia is a nuclear power and one of 2 superpowers. Stalin will test American strength at every opportunity. But at home, his paranoia continues to grow. Stalin sees himself surrounded by enemies and trusts no one.
His whole life, Stalin was waging some kind of campaign. First, he fought the kulaks, or the Trotskyists, or the supporters of Synoev, and then some other group of so-called enemies. That means there was always one group in the foreground that had to be destroyed, and so these people were arrested. After the war, there was a new campaign, this time against the Jews.
Towards the end of 1952, Stalin starts rumors that Jewish doctors in the Kremlin are conspiring to assassinate the leadership of the country. Stalin is afraid of his own doctors.
He had the flu. The doctor is called from the Kremlin clinic, as usual. He duly examines him, prescribes medicine, which he has with him, and leaves it there. Then Stalin calls one of the staff whom he knows and sends him to a pharmacist outside Moscow to buy the same medicine. The ones the doctor has left, he just throws away.
Stalin's last purge targets intellectuals, professors, artists, writers. Russia's elite, hauled off to the Gulag by the thousands. They are Stalin's last victims.
Stalin was not scared of his enemies outside. What he really dreaded were those on the inside. Stalin always felt threatened only by his own people, which he deeply despised.
In the madness of his last years, Stalin plots the use of the atomic bomb and the occupation of all of Europe. He also plans, yet again, for the murder of his closest advisors.
If Stalin had lived any longer, Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov, and probably also Beria would have been the first to be arrested and liquidated. There were very clear indications for this to happen. And then it would have been someone else's turn. For Stalin was preparing an extensive purge.
But on the 2nd of March, 1953, alone in his dacha, Stalin suffers a stroke. 3 days later, he is dead. When he died, the people that he had oppressed and tortured are, amazingly, moved to tears.
Yes, for me that was the day almost of despair. I thought now things are going to get worse.
So many close relatives. I lost many because of him. I don't know why. There's something I can't explain to this day. But I cried too. Yes, I wept.
Stalin is, to my mind, the titanic figure of the 20th century. All the power of that Russian state and that Russian history was concentrated in one man. He knew how to take a peasant who was born without shoes and make him into a general. Wouldn't you love this man who was capable of doing that? Many alive today saw it, witnessed it, felt it. And if 20 million people died, well, what are you going to do?
In the Gulag, there is no mourning.
That day, I walked through the camp and thanked all the gods for Stalin's death. It was a secret joy, because it would have been dangerous to show it in public.
He was the devil incarnate. The devil incarnate.
Soon after his death, Stalin's son Vasily is thrown out of the army and spends the rest of his life in jail. His daughter, Svetlana, leaves the country, a refugee. And just 3 years later, Stalin's body is removed in the dead of night from the Lenin mausoleum. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, denounces Stalin as a criminal. Then, slowly, the myth of Stalin also dies. In this earlier propaganda film of the October Revolution, Stalin stands next to Lenin. Now the truth has been restored. Stalin is no longer part of the picture. It is known as de-Stalinization. Stalin, the man of steel. His monuments once loomed over every village. Now they gather dust in junk rooms. And yet, other memories linger. Even today, there is an enigmatic affection for the man.
Take a look at Russia today. Who is the hero? The hero is Stalin. Even Democrats in Russia would tell you, sure, Stalin had tens of millions of people killed, but he turned Russia into a superpower.
His victims lie here, in the Russian soil, in Siberian soil. Priests, soldiers, and farmers. The innocent victims of a man who dominated the Russian landscape for over a quarter of a century.